In my last video, I showed you how to make this web page. As you can see, it has lots of different sections, different column layouts, there's an embedded map, and it has a few other features as well, like hover styles and click-to-scroll navigation. It's also fully responsive, so it also looks good on mobile devices. Today, I'm going to show you how to create a simple modal window that animates onto the screen when the user clicks an icon. As you can see, it's pretty basic, but it matches the style of the website, which is important. There's a space for a username, and a password, and a nice big login button. I'll be using Replit to code this, and I'll include a link in the description so that you can code along with me. I'm also going to be coding with Emmet. Everything is awesome. Not that Emmet, or that one. Emmet is actually a plugin that's installed by default in Replit, and it basically lets you code using a kind of shorthand that's automatically expanded into full HTML and CSS. It takes a little bit of getting used to at first, but once you get the hang of it, there's really no going back. This is completely optional though, so feel free to type out the code in full if you prefer. Okay, so let's get started. Now the first thing I'm going to do is just show the CSS in a separate tab, which makes it nice and easy to switch between the documents. Also means I can hide the files panel and just get a bit more space to do my coding. And the first thing I'm going to do is actually code the semi-transparent black background that appears behind the modal. So to do that, I'm actually going to create a div right at the top of the code, just inside the body tag. And remember, I'm using Emmet, and when you're typing Emmet for HTML, it's actually really easy because you're using CSS selectors. So if I want to create a div with a specific class, all I have to do is type the class, just as you would in CSS. So watch this. I'm going to type dot overlay and then hit tab. And you'll see that it turned that into a div with the class of overlay. So that's going to be the div that overlays everything, giving me that nice kind of semi-transparent black background. So now let's create the actual modal. This is where I'm going to show you the real power of Emmet, because I'm going to code the entire structure for my modal on just one line. Okay, so it would look like this. First of all, I'd like a div with a class of modal. Now inside that div, and to do this, I'm going to use the child selector. So inside the div with a class of modal, I'm going to create another div called modal close. Now after that div, so I'm going to use a plus. Now in CSS, that's the sibling selector. So that means the next element will not be inside modal close, it will come after it, as you'll see in the preview in just a second. So the next thing I'm going to have is a div with the class of user. That's going to contain the icon that sits at the top of my little modal window. Now after that, I want an h4. That's going to contain the title. And then after that, I'm going to have another div, and this is going to contain the form, which has the input and the button. So now I need to use my child selector again. So inside this div, I'm going to create a form. And inside that form, I want to have an input. And I actually want two of those, so I'm going to put ×2. Gives me 2 inputs. And then I want a button. So take a look at the preview underneath, and you can see that from this one single line of Emmet, I can build all of that HTML structure. And as soon as I hit tab, there we go. Now the other benefit to Emmet is that once you've created your HTML, you then get these tab points, so you can easily tab into the different parts of the code and fill in the content that you want. So in this modal close section, I actually want there to be a cross, something the user can click on to close the modal. But I don't actually want to use an X, because X's just don't look very good. What I actually want is a times symbol, a multiplication symbol. And I could go online and find one and copy and paste it in, but the better way to do it is actually to use an HTML entity. What that basically is, it's like a little bit of code that you can type in, which your browser recognizes and turns into the correct symbol. So it starts with an and then you type in whichever symbol it is you want, and then a semicolon. So when the browser looks at this HTML and renders the web page, it will turn and times semicolon into an actual times symbol. And there are lots of these. If you look them up, just Google HTML entity, you'll find there's lots of others, like the copyright symbol, for example. Or if you just want an ampersand, the and sign, you could do that. But I want the times symbol. Now the user div I'm going to leave empty for the moment. I'll come back later on and put the icon in there. Now the h4, I want this to say member login. Now for the two inputs, I could leave them both as text, but the second one really should be set to password. And you'll see what that does in a minute when I run my code. And then finally, the button, I would like some text in here that actually says login. So let's go ahead and run that and see what we've got. Now obviously at the moment it looks a bit odd because we haven't lifted it off the page, it's just sitting above the header, which is where it is in the HTML. But you can see that we do have the time symbol at the top, and you can see that we've got our two inputs and a button. And if I click into the second input, you'll see that because we set it to password, it actually obscures the text that you enter. So now let's head over to the CSS and style this up. Now remember, it's a good idea to use comments in your CSS. It really does make it easier if you do this. All right, so I'm going to start by styling the overlay. So dot overlay, and I'm going to be using Emmet as well here. And in CSS, Emmet is all about just learning these short abbreviations for all of the different properties. So I'm going to start by setting the overlay to be position fixed. So that's going to be pos F. And when I hit tab, position fixed. Now I want this to be the full height and width of the page, so I'm going to specify height 100. Notice that by default that will put pixels on it, but I'm going to put percent. So just h 100%, hit tab, and the same for width, 100%. There we go. Now for the background, I'm just going to type BG and then hit tab, and in here I can type in the color that I want, but I'm actually going to type in something different. I'm going to use RGB. So this lets me specify the color that I want using an amount of red, green and blue. And the reason why I'm doing it this way is because if I say 000 for the three colors, I can then also do / and do a percentage for the opacity. So I'm going to set this to 50%. So this effectively creates a semi-transparent black box. So let's run this and see what we get. So you can see there's that semi-transparent background. It's currently behind the header though, so to fix that I'm just going to put z index 1. And that's just going to make sure that in terms of the layers, this is now the very top layer. So the overlay appears in front of everything. So now let's go ahead and actually style the modal itself. So dot modal. And again, I want to use position fixed. I'm going to give this a width of 300 pixels. So just W300. Now I want the background of this element to be white. So I'm just going to type BG and then I'm just going to put white. And if I run that now, just to show you what we've got, you can see that it's now sitting up in the top left corner and it's 300 pixels wide. We need to bring this in front of everything. So I'm going to use Z index again, but this time 2 to make sure, of course, that it's in front of the overlay. There you go. So now you can see it's in front of everything. The next thing to do is to actually get it centered in the middle of the screen. So I've already put position fixed onto it. And remember that once you do position, it then allows you to use top, bottom, left, and right. So I'm going to go ahead and put top 50% and also left 50%. Now, if you look at the top left corner of that modal window, that is the point that is actually centered on the screen. And to get the whole window to be properly centered, what I now need to do is to move the window left by 50% of its width and move it up by 50% of its height. And I can do that by translating it using the transform property. So that looks like this. Now you can see this has X and Y. So X is going to be the left and right movement and Y is going to be the up and down movement. So what I want to do is actually move this backwards by 50%. Now this is 50% of the width of the element. But when I did top and left, that was 50% relative to the height and width of the actual page. So I want to move it left 50% the width of the element, and I want to move it up by minus 50% of its height. So if we run that again, you can see that now we have a perfectly centered modal window. All right, let's keep going. I do want there to be some space around the things inside my modal, so I'm going to use padding for that. And let's go for padding 50 pixels, P50. There we go. And I want to round the corners a little bit, so for that I need to use border radius. And we'll go for about 5 pixels. And now we'll move on to style the bits inside the modal window. So I'm going to start with the little close button. So that's going to be dot modal close. First thing I'm going to do is make it bigger. So for that I'm going to use font size, just FSZ, and I'm going to go for 32 pixels. And the next thing I need to do is move it so that it's in the top right corner. So I'm going to use position absolute first of all, and I can now use top 0 and right 0. Now that positions it all the way over to the right, but you'll notice that there's a slight gap above that cross. So let's go ahead and inspect and see if we can find out what the problem is. So if I hover over that element, you can clearly see that it's about 15 pixels wide and it's about 35-36 pixels high. So why is there this extra height on there? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. If I go back into the HTML and add in some letters, let's put in a P and a G, for example, and run this again, you can see that actually the reason why it occupies all of that space is because it has to accommodate other letters as well. So ascenders and descenders. It just so happens that the little time symbol sits in the middle. I can fix this problem by just adjusting the line height. So if I go up into the style and type in line height, and let's set this to about half of the font size. Let's try 16 pixels. There you go. You can see that that cross now sits perfectly up in the corner, but any other letters that are in here are going to start being chopped off. But that's fine because I only want the time symbol to be in here anyway. So let's just delete the PG and we'll head back over to the CSS and we'll drop in the line height as well. LH 16 pixels. Now I don't actually want that cross to sit all the way up in the top right corner like that because it just doesn't look very good. I want there to be some space around it. Now I could adjust the top and right values that I've put in there, but a better way to do this is going to be to put some padding around that cross, because that way that padding will actually count as part of the height and width of the element, which means that the user will be able to click anywhere around that cross within the padding and still close the modal. So let's go for padding 15 pixels. There we go. And finally, the user is going to expect there to be a little hand when they hover over this. So I'm going to adjust the cursor and change that to pointer. And if I move my mouse over the cross, you'll see that it changes to the pointer before I actually get to the cross. You can see that that green padding area is adding to the height and width of this element. So once we've done the JavaScript, the user will be able to click on the time symbol or any of that green padding area around it to activate the close button. So now I'm going to style the H4. Now I want to make sure that I don't accidentally overwrite any of the styles for other H4 tags that I might have elsewhere on the page. So I'm going to use specificity here. I'm going to make sure that I only style the H4 tag that is inside .modal. And I'm not going to do a great deal to this. I'm going to change the font size and I'm going to go for 28 pixels. I'm also going to change the margin above and below. So I'm going to go margin, let's go for 25 pixels. That's going to put a margin all the way around. I only want the margin on the top and the bottom. So I'm just going to go in here and pop in 0 as well. So that's 25 pixels top and bottom margin, but 0 pixels on the left and the right. And then finally, I would like it to be centered. So text align center. And we'll move on to the inputs. And again, going to use specificity to make sure that I only target the inputs that are inside modal. So first things first, I want to set the width of these to be 100% because I want these two input fields to occupy the full width of the modal window. There we go. I also want there to be a gap below these two inputs so that everything's nicely spaced out. So I'm going to go for margin bottom 20 pixels. Now I do want to introduce a bit of padding around the text inside these inputs, but I've noticed that at the moment the user's not going to know what to actually type into these two inputs, because what I haven't yet done is put placeholder text in. So let's go back to the HTML, and I'm going to go inside the first input, and I'm going to add a placeholder attribute, and this one is going to say username, and I'm going to do the same thing in here, placeholder, and this one's going to say password. So now the user gets a helpful prompt so that they know what to type. Back into my CSS, I said I wanted to put a little bit of space around that text. So let's go for padding 15 pixels. The next thing I want to do is just remove that default border that comes with inputs. So I'm going to go ahead and type in border, and I'm happy with 1 pixel solid, but I'm going to change the color to a nice kind of soft gray. There we go. And finally, let's add a border radius of 5 pixels. And now we can move on to the button. So I'm going to say dot modal button. I'm going to start by changing the background of the button because I want to use that same yellow color that I've used across this whole site. I want the text of the button to be white. I'm going to increase the font size as well, and also put some padding around the text. I'm going to remove the border completely, border none, BDN in Emmet, and I also want the button to be the full width of the modal window. So I'm going to say width 100%. And finally, let's put some border radius onto this as well. And we're nearly there at this point. I now need to locate the user icon that I used in the header, and remember that I'm using Font Awesome here for my icons, and I just need to pop that in here inside the user div. Okay, so let's go ahead and style that in CSS. So I'm putting it here because in the HTML it appears just above the H4, so that seems like a sensible place to put it in my CSS. So I'm going to say .modal.user, and the first thing I'm going to do is give it a height and a width. So I want a height of 100 pixels and a width of 100 pixels. I want this to be a circle, so I'm going to set the border radius to be 50%. I need the background color to be that same color that I used before, that yellow color. So I'm going to go BG. And I want the color to be white. And it looks like it's vanished completely, but in fact it's just sitting up here in this top left corner. If I just give this a nice font size of, let's say 64 pixels. Now we can see it. Now to center the icon inside the circle, there's a few things that I could do, but I'm going to do this using Flex. So I'm going to use Display Flex first of all. And now that I've done that, it allows me to use Align Items, Center, and that's going to center it vertically. And I can also use Justify Content Center to center it horizontally. And now I need to reposition this circle. I want it to be in the middle, and I want it to be kind of half in and half out of the modal window. So to do that, I'm going to use Position Absolute first of all. And now I'm going to say top minus 50 pixels. So that positions it up there. And now to get it to sit in the middle, I'm going to use Margin 0 Auto. So what this does this is setting the left margin and the right margin of the element to be automatic, which centers it on the page. But normally this wouldn't work with an element that is absolutely positioned. But if you also set the left property to be 0 and the right property to be 0, it actually allows that margin auto to work as you would expect. So there we go. So that's our login modal complete. And now we can look at how we actually get it to animate on and off the screen. So let's begin by hiding it off the screen. So I'm going to go to the overlay first of all, and for this I'm just going to put display none so that it's hidden. So that semi-transparent black background is gone. And for the modal, instead of it being top 50%, I'm going to put top minus 50%. So that's going to move it off the page, off the top of the page. And now we can look at how we bring it back onto the page. So to do this, what I'm actually going to do is create another class, which handles how I want it to look when it should be showing on the screen. So I'm going to put dot overlay dot show. So when the overlay box also has the class of show, I want it to be display block so that it goes back to being visible. And I'm going to do the same thing for my modal. I'm going to say dot modal dot show. And what I need to do here is set this back to being top 50% so that it's back into the center of the screen. Now on its own, that's going to do nothing, of course, because now what I need to do is write some JavaScript so that when I click the login icon in the header, that show class is added to the overlay box and the modal. So let's head over to the HTML. Now, in order for the JavaScript to work, I need a way of identifying some of the elements on this page. So starting with the icon that you click in the header. So that's this one right here. So I'm going to go inside the list item and I'm going to give it an ID. And we'll call this login. So now in my JavaScript I can say when login is clicked. But I also need a way of identifying the overlay and the modal. So let's go on to the overlay and we'll give it an ID of overlay. And for the modal, you guessed it, ID modal. All right, so let's scroll down and create the JavaScript. So as you can see, we've already got a bit of JavaScript on this page. If you're interested in how this works, then you need to watch my previous videos. What I'm going to do now is just go to the top of the code and type document.get element by ID. And the element that I want to get at this point is the login icon in the header. And I want to add an event listener to that element. Now, in websites, an event is simply something that the user does on the page. It could be click, it could be scroll, maybe they hover over something, they resize the browser. All of those are events that you can attach code to. But in this case, the event that I'm looking for is the click event. So when the user clicks the login button, what I want to do is run this function. I want to go onto the document again, and this time get element by ID, and I want to get the overlay box, get the class list for that overlay box, and add the show class. And what I'm now going to do to save myself some time is just copy that, because I also need that to happen for the modal. Okay, so let's give this a try. There we go. I click it, and as you can see, it appears on the screen. But at the moment, the cross doesn't allow me to close it again. So in order to do that, I actually need to go back up to my modal window. I need to find the close div, which is this one here. Let's give this an ID as well. So I'm going to put ID, and we'll call this close. Back down to our JavaScript, and I'm simply going to copy all of that. Change this so that instead of the login being clicked on, it's the close button, And instead of adding the class, I want to remove the class. Let's run it again. So now I can open the modal with this button, and I can close the modal with this button. The last thing I want to do is make it so that instead of it just appearing instantly, we get a nice animation. So what I'm going to do is head back to my style, and I'm going to go into the modal, and I'm going to apply a transition. And I'm going to set this to be 0.3 seconds. So now we get this nice animation effect. And that looks okay, but we can make this even better. If I set the opacity to 0, so that when it's off the screen it's also invisible, and then when it comes onto the screen set the opacity to 1, it will gradually fade into view as it slides onto the screen. So let's give this a try. And there you go, our pop-up modal window using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript.